Welcome to 365 Motivationals, your daily dose of inspiration, wisdom, and personal growth. Here we uncover life-changing ideas from timeless books, giving you the tools to transform your mindset and achieve your goals. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like it. It helps others discover our content and supports the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments. We love hearing from you. And if you're not already part of our community, hit subscribe to stay motivated every day. Let's unlock your full potential together. Summary of Reincarnation and the Law of Karma by William Walker Atkinson. In Reincarnation and the Law of Karma, William Walker Atkinson explores profound spiritual concepts that connect life, death, and rebirth. The book delves into the ancient belief in reincarnation, explaining how souls journey through multiple lifetimes to evolve and learn spiritual lessons. Atkinson breaks down the law of karma, revealing how our thoughts, actions, and intentions influence our future experiences. This work inspires readers to take responsibility for their lives, embrace ethical living, and cultivate positive energy. By understanding the cyclical nature of existence and the impact of karma, Atkinson guides us toward personal growth, harmony, and a deeper connection to the universe.
Chapter 1. The Early Races. By reincarnation, we mean the repeated incarnation or embodiment in flesh of the soul or immaterial part of man's nature. The term metempsychosis is frequently employed in the same sense, the definition of the latter term being the passage of the soul as an immortal essence at the death of the body into another living body. The term transmigration of souls is sometimes employed, the term being used in the sense of passing from one body into another. But the term transmigration is often used in connection with the belief of certain undeveloped races who held that the soul of men sometimes passed into the bodies of the lower animals as a punishment for their sins committed during the human life. But this belief is held in disrepute by the adherents of reincarnation or metempsychosis and has no connection with their philosophy or beliefs, the ideas having sprung from an entirely different source and having nothing in common. There are many forms of belief, many degrees of doctrine, regarding reincarnation, as we shall see as we proceed, but there is a fundamental and basic principle underlying all of the various shades of opinion and divisions of the schools. This fundamental belief may be expressed as the doctrine that there is in man an immaterial something, called the soul, spirit, inner self, or many other names, which does not perish at the death or disintegration of the body, but which persists as an entity, and after a shorter or longer interval of rest, reincarnates, or is reborn, into a new body, that of an unborn infant, from whence it proceeds to live a new life in the body, more or less unconscious of its past existences, but containing within itself the essence or results of its past lives, which experiences go to make up its new character, or personality. It is usually held that the rebirth is governed by the law of attraction, under one name or another, and which law operates in accordance with strict justice in the direction of attracting the reincarnating soul to a body, and conditions in accordance with the tendencies of the past life, the parents also attracting to them a soul bound to them by some ties in the past, the law being universal, uniform, and equitable to all concerned in the matter. This is a general statement of the doctrine as it is generally held by the most intelligent of its adherents. E.D. Walker, a well-known English writer on the subject, gives the following beautiful idea of the general teachings. Reincarnation teaches that the soul enters this life, not as a fresh creation, but after a long course of previous existences on this earth and elsewhere, in which it acquired its present inherent peculiarities, and that it is on the way to future transformations which the soul is now shaping. It claims that infancy brings to earth not a blank scroll for the beginning of an earthly record, nor a mere cohesion of atomic forces into a brief personality soon to dissolve again into the elements, but that it is inscribed with ancestral histories, some like the present scene, most of them unlike it and stretching back into the remotest past. These inscriptions are generally undecipherable, save as revealed in their molding influence upon the new career. But like the invisible photographic images made by the sun of all it sees, when they are properly developed in the laboratory of consciousness, they will be distinctly displayed. The current phase of life will also be stored away in the secret vaults of memory for its unconscious effects upon the ensuing lives. All the qualities we now possess, in body, mind, and soul, result from our use of ancient opportunities. We are indeed the heir of all the ages, and are alone responsible for our inheritances. For these conditions accrue from distant causes engendered by our older selves, and the future flows by the divine law of cause and effect from the gathered momentum of our past impetuses. There is no favoritism in the universe, but all have the same everlasting facilities for growth. Those who are now elevated in worldly station may be sunk in humble surroundings in the future. Only the inner traits of the soul are permanent companions. The wealthy sluggard may be the beggar of the next life, and the industrious worker of the present is sowing the seeds of future greatness. Suffering bravely endured now will produce a treasure of patience and fortitude in another life. Hardships will give rise to strength. Self-denial must develop the will. Tastes cultivated in this existence will somehow bear fruit in coming ones, and acquired energies will assert themselves whenever they can by the law of parsimony upon which the principles of physics are based. Vice versa, the unconscious habits, the uncontrollable impulses, the peculiar tendencies, the favorite pursuits, and the soul-stirring friendships of the present descend from far-reaching previous activities. The doctrine of reincarnation, metempsychosis, rebirth, has always been held as truth by a large portion of the human race. Following the invariable law of cyclic changes, the swing of the pendulum of thought, at times it has apparently died out in parts of the world, only to be again succeeded by a new birth and interest among the descendants of the same people. It is a light impossible to extinguish, and although its flickering flame may seem to die out for a moment, the shifting of the mental winds again allows it to rekindle from the hidden spark, and lo, again it bursts into new life and vigor. The reawakened interest in the subject in the Western world, of which all keen observers have taken note, is but another instance of the operation of the cyclic law. It begins to look as if the occultists are right when they predict that before the dawn of another century, the Western world will once more have embraced the doctrines of rebirth. The old, discarded truth, once so dear to the race, will again be settled in popular favor, and again move toward the position of orthodox teaching, perhaps to be again crystallized by reason of its orthodoxy, and again to lose favor and fade away, as the pendulum swings backward to the other extreme of thought. But the teaching of reincarnation never has passed away altogether from the race. In some parts of the world, the lamp has been kept burning brightly. Nay, more, at no time in human history has there been a period in which the majority of the race has not accepted the doctrine of rebirth in some of its various forms. It was so 1,000 years ago, 2,000, 5,000, and it is so today. In this 20th century, nearly if not quite 2/3 of the race hold firmly to the teaching, and the multitudes of Hindus and other Eastern peoples cling to it tenaciously. And, even outside of these people, there are to be found traces of the doctrine among other races in the East and West. So reincarnation is not a forgotten truth or discarded doctrine, but one fully alive and vigorous, and one which is destined to play a very important part in the history of Western thought during the 20th century. It is interesting to trace the history of the doctrine among the ancient peoples, away back into the dim recesses of the past. It is difficult to ascribe to any particular time or any particular race the credit of having originated reincarnation. In spite of the decided opinions and the differing theories of the various writers on this subject, who would give Egypt or India or the lost Atlantis as the birthplace of the doctrine, we feel that such ideas are but attempts to attribute a universal intuitive belief to some favored part of the race. We do not believe that the doctrine of reincarnation ever originated anywhere as a new and distinct doctrine. We believe that it sprang into existence whenever and wherever man arrived at a stage of intellectual development sufficient to enable him to form a mental conception of a something that lived after death. No matter from what source this belief in a ghost originated, it must be admitted that it is found among all peoples and is apparently an universal idea. And, running along with it in the primitive peoples, we find that there is, and always has been, an idea, more or less vague and indistinct, that somehow, someway, sometime, this ghost of the person returns to earthly existence and takes upon itself a new fleshly garment, a new body. Here, then, is where the idea of reincarnation begins, everywhere, at a certain stage of human mental development. It runs parallel with the ghost idea and seems bound up with that conception in nearly every case. When man evolves a little further, he begins to reason that if the ghost is immortal and survives the death of the body and returns to take upon itself a new body, then it must have lived before the last birth, and therefore must have a long chain of lives behind it. This is the second step. The third step is when man begins to reason that the next life is dependent upon something done or left undone in the present life. And upon these three fundamental ideas, the doctrine of reincarnation has been built. The occultists claim that in addition to this universal idea, which is more or less intuitive, the race has received more or less instruction, from time to time, from certain advanced souls which have passed on to higher planes of existence, and who are now called the masters, adepts, teachers, race guides, etc., etc. But whatever may be the explanation, it remains a truth that man seems to have worked out for himself, in all times and in all places, first, an idea of a ghost, which persists after the body dies, and second, that this ghost has lived before in other bodies and will return again to take on a new body. There are various ideas regarding heavens and hells, but underlying them all, there persists this idea of rebirth in some of its phases. Soldi, the archaeologist, has published an interesting series of works dealing with the beliefs of primitive peoples who have passed from the scene of human action. He shows by the fragments of carving and sculpture which have survived them that there was an universal idea among them of the ghost which lived after the body died, and a corresponding idea that someday this ghost would return to the scene of its former activities. This belief sometimes took the form of a return into the former body, which idea led to the preservation of the body by processes of mummifying, etc. But as a rule, this belief developed into the more advanced one of a rebirth in a new body. The earlier travelers in Africa have reported that here and there they found evidences and traces of what was to them a strange belief in the future return of the soul to a new body on Earth. The early explorers of America found similar traditions and beliefs among the Red Indians, survivals of which exist even unto this day. It is related of a number of savage tribes in different parts of the world that they place the bodies of their dead children by the roadside, in order that their souls may be given a good chance to find new bodies by reason of the approaching of many traveling pregnant women who pass along the road. A number of these primitive people hold to the idea of a complex soul, composed of several parts, in which they resemble the Egyptians, Hindus, Chinese, and in fact all mystical and occult philosophies. The Fiji Islanders are said to believe in a black soul and a white soul, the former of which remains with the buried body and disintegrates with it, while the white soul leaves the body and wanders as a ghost, and afterward, tiring of the wandering, returns to life in a new body. The natives of Greenland are said to believe in an astral body, which leaves the body during sleep, but which perishes as the body disintegrates after death, and a second soul, which leaves the body only at death, and which persists until it is reborn at a later time. In fact, the student finds that nearly all of the primitives' races, and those semi-civilized, show traces of a belief in a complex soul, and a trace of doctrine of reincarnation in some form. The human mind seems to work along the same lines among the different races, unless one holds to the theory that all sprang from the same root race, and that the various beliefs are survivals of some ancient fundamental doctrine. The facts are not disturbed in either case. In the last mentioned connection, we might mention that the traditions concerning ancient Atlantis, the lost continent, all hold to the effect that her people believed strongly in reincarnation and to the ideas of the complex soul. As the survivors of Atlantis are believed to have been the ancestors of the Egyptians on the one hand and of the ancient Peruvians on the other, the two branches of survivors having maintained their original doctrines as modified by different environments, we might find here an explanation of the prevalence of the doctrine on both sides of the ocean. We mention this merely in passing and as of general interest in the line of our subject. Chapter 2. The Egyptians, Chaldeans, Druids, etc. After considering the existence of the doctrines of reincarnation among the primitive peoples and its traditional existence among the vanished peoples of the past, we find ourselves irresistibly borne toward that ancient land of mystery, the home of the mystics and occultists of the past, the land of Isis, the home of the builders of the pyramids, the people of the Sphinx. Whether these people were the direct descendants of the people of destroyed Atlantis, the home of the ancient wisdom, or whether they were a new people who had rediscovered the old doctrines, the fact remains that when tracing back any old occult or mystic doctrine, we find ourselves gradually led toward the land of the Sphinx as the source of that hidden truth. The Sphinx is a fit emblem of that wonderful race. Its sealed lips seem to invite the ultimate questions, and one feels that there may be a whispered answer wafted from those tightly closed lips toward the ear that is prepared to hear and receive it. And so, in our search for the origin of reincarnation, we find ourselves once more confronting the Egyptian Sphinx, as we have done so often before in our search after truth. Notwithstanding its obvious prehistoric origin, many have claimed that metempsychosis has its birthplace in Old Egypt, on the banks of the Nile. India disputes this claim, holding that the Ganges, not the Nile, gave birth to the doctrine. Be that as it may, we shall treat the Egyptian conception at this place, among the ancient lands holding the doctrine, for in India it is not a thing of the past, but a doctrine which has its full flower at the present time, and which flower is sending forth its subtle odor to all parts of the civilized world. And so we shall defer our consideration of India's teachings until we reach the present stage of the history of reincarnation. Herodotus, many centuries ago, said of the Egyptians that the Egyptians are the first who propounded the theory that the human soul is imperishable, and that where the body of any one dies, it enters into some other body that may be ready to receive it, and that when it has gone the round of all created forms on land, in water, and in air, then it once more enters the human body born for it, and that this cycle of existence for the soul takes place in 3,000 years. The doctrine of reincarnation is discernible, though hidden away amidst the mass of esoteric doctrine, back of the exoteric teachings of the Egyptians, which latter were expounded to the common people, while the truth was reserved for the few who were ready for it. The inner circles of the Egyptian mystics believed in and understood the inner truths of reincarnation, and although they guarded the esoteric teachings carefully, still fragments fell from the table and were greedily taken up by the masses, as we may see by an examination of the scraps of historical records which have been preserved, graven in the stone, and imprinted on the bricks. Not only did these people accept the doctrine of reincarnation, but Egypt was really the home of the highest occult teachings. The doctrines and teachings regarding several sheaths or bodies of man, which are taught by occultists of all times and races, are believed to have been fully taught in their original purity on the banks of the Nile and in the shadow of the pyramids. Yes, even before the days of the pyramids. Their 40 centuries of history saw many modifications of the philosophical and religious beliefs, but the fundamental doctrine of reincarnation was held to during the entire period of history in ancient Egypt and was not discarded until the decadent descendants of the once mighty race were overwhelmed by stronger races whose religions and beliefs superseded the vestiges of the ancient doctrine. The Egyptians held that there was Ka, the divine spirit in man, Ab, the intellect or will, Hati, the vitality, Tet, the astral body, Sahu, the etheric double, and Eksa, the physical body, some authorities forming a slightly different arrangement, which correspond to the various bodies of man as recognized by occultists today. The ancient Chaldeans also taught the doctrine of rebirth. The body of Persian and Chaldean mystics and occultists, known as the Magi, who were masters of the hidden wisdom, held to the doctrine of reincarnation as one of their fundamental truths. In fact, they managed to educate the masses of their people to a much higher point than the masses of the Egyptians, and escaping the idolatrous tendencies of the Egyptian populace, they manifested a very high degree of pure philosophical, occult, and religious knowledge. The Magi taught that the soul was a complex being and that certain portions of it perished, while certain other parts survived and passed on through a series of earth and otherworld existences, until finally it attained such a degree of purity that it was relieved of the necessity for further incarnation, and thenceforth dwelt in the region of ineffable bliss, the region of light eternal. The teaching also held that just before entering into the state of bliss, the soul was able to review its previous incarnations, seeing distinctly the connection between them, and thus gaining a store of the wisdom of experience, which would aid it in its future work as a helper of future races which would appear on the face of the earth. The Magi taught that as all living things, nay, all things having existence, organic or inorganic, were but varying manifestations of the one life and being, therefore the highest knowledge implied a feeling of conscious brotherhood and relationship toward and with all. Even among the Chinese, there was an esoteric teaching concerning reincarnation beneath the outer teaching of ages past. It may be discerned in the teachings of the early philosophers and seers of the race, notably in the work of Lao Tse, the great Chinese sage and teacher. Lao Tse, whose great work, the Tao Te King, is a classic, taught reincarnation to his inner circle of students and adherents, at least so many authorities claim. He taught that there existed a fundamental principle called Tao, which is held to have been identical with the primordial reason, a manifestation of which was the Te, or the creative activity of the universe. From the union and action of the Tao and the Te proceeded the universe, including the human soul, which he taught was composed of several parts, among them being the Huan, or spiritual principle, and the Fi, or semi-material vital principle, which together animate the body. Lao Tse said, "To be ignorant that the true self is immortal is to remain in a grievous state of error, and to experience many calamities by reason thereof. Know ye that there is a part of man which is subtle and spiritual, and which is the heaven-bound portion of himself. That which has to do with flesh, bones, and body belongs to the earth, earthly to earth, heavenly to heaven. Such is the law." Some have held that Lao Tse taught the immediate return of the Huan to the Tao after death, but from the writings of his early followers, it may be seen that he really taught that the Huan persisted in individual existence throughout repeated incarnations, returning to the Mem, Tao, only when it had completed its round of experience life. For instance, in the Si Hai, it is said that the vital essence is dispersed after death together with the body, bones, and flesh, but the soul, or knowing principle of the self, is preserved and does not perish. There is no immediate absorption of the individuality into the Tao, for individuality persists and manifests itself according to the law. And Chuang-Tze said, "Death is but the commencement of a new life." It was also taught by the early Taoists that the deeds, good and evil, of the present life would bear fruit in future existences. In addition to the orthodox heavens and hells, in which the Chinese believed, and of which they had a great variety adapted to the requirements of the various grades of saints and sinners, the minute details of which places being described with that attention to minor details and particulars peculiar to the Chinese mind. The teachings of a later date, that the soul of the ancestor abided in the hall of the ancestors, etc., were a corruption of the ancient teaching. Other Chinese teachers taught that the soul consists of three parts, the first being the Kui, which had its seat in the belly and which perished with the body, the second being the Ling, which had its seat in the heart or chest, and which persisted for some time after death, but which eventually disintegrated, and the third, or Huan, which had its seat in the brain, and which survived the disintegration of its companions, and then passed on to other existences. As strange as it may appear to many readers unfamiliar with the subject, the ancient Druids, particularly those dwelling in ancient Gaul, were familiar with the doctrine of reincarnation and believed in its tenets. These people, generally regarded as ancient barbarians, really possessed a philosophy of a high order, which merged into a mystic form of religion. Many of the Romans, upon their conquest of Gallia, were surprised at the degree and character of the philosophical knowledge possessed by the Druids, and many of them have left written records of the same, notably in the case of Aristotle, Sar, Lucan, and Valerius Maximus. The Christian teachers who succeeded them also bore witness to these facts, as may be seen by reference to the works of St. Clement, St. Cyril, and other of the early Christian fathers. These ancient barbarians entertained some of the highest spiritual conceptions of life and immortality, the mind and the soul. Renaud has written of them, basing his statements upon a careful study of the ancient beliefs of this race. If Judea represents in the world, with a tenacity of its own, the idea of a personal and absolute God, if Greece and Rome represent the idea of society, Gaul represents, just as particularly, the idea of immortality. Nothing characterized it better, as all the ancients admit. That mysterious folk was looked upon as the privileged possessor of the secrets of death, and its unwavering instinctive faith in the persistence of life never ceased to be a cause of astonishment, and sometimes of fear, in the eyes of the heathen. The Gauls possessed an occult philosophy and a mystic religion which were destroyed by the influences of the Roman conquest. The philosophy of the Druids bore a remarkable resemblance to the inner doctrine of the Egyptians and their successors, the Grecian mystics. Traces of Hermeticism and Pythagoreanism are clearly discernible, although the connecting link that bound them together has been lost to history. Legends among the Druids connected their order with the ancient Aryan creeds and teachings, and there seems to have been a very close connection between these priests and those of ancient Greece, for there are tales of offerings being sent to the temples of Greece from the priests of Gaul. And it is also related that on the island of Delphos there was once a Druidic tomb in the shape of a monument, believed to have been erected over the remains of Druid priestesses. Herodotus and others speak of a secret alliance between the priests of Greece and those of the Druids. Some of the ancient legends hold that Pythagoras was the instructor of the Druidic priests, and that Pythagoras himself was in close communication with the Brahmins of India and the Hermetists of Egypt. Other legends have it that the Druids received their first instruction from Zamolais, who had been a slave and student of Pythagoras. At any rate, the correspondence between the two schools of philosophy is remarkable. Much of the Druidic teachings has been lost, and it is difficult to piece together the fragments. But enough is known to indicate the above-mentioned relationship to the Pythagorean school, and of the firm hold of the doctrine of reincarnation upon the Druids. The preserved fragments show that the Druids taught that there was in man an immaterial spiritual part called awen, which proceeded from an universal spiritual principle of life. They taught that this awen had animated the lower forms of life, mineral, vegetable, and animal, before incarnating as man. In those conditions, it was entangled and imprisoned in the state of abysmal circling, called anufu, from which it finally escaped and entered into the circle of freedom, called abred, or human incarnation and beyond. This state of abred includes life in the various human races on this and other planets, until finally there is a further liberation of the awen, which then passes on to the circle of bliss, or Gwynfid, where it abides for sons in a state of ecstatic being. But beyond even this transcendent state, there is another, which is called the circle of the infinite, or Sugent, which is identical with the union with God of the Persians and Greek mystics, or the nirvana of the Hindus. Rather an advanced form of philosophy for barbarians, is it not? Particularly when contrasted with the crude mythology of the Roman conquerors. The Gauls were so advanced in the practical phases of occultism that they gave every condemned criminal a respite of 5 years, after sentence of death, before execution, in order that he might prepare himself for a future state by meditation, instruction, and other preparation, and also to prevent ushering an unprepared and guilty soul into the plane of the departed, the advantages of which plan is apparent to every student of occultism who accepts the teaching regarding the astral planes. The reader will understand, of course, that the degree of advancement in spiritual and philosophical matters evidenced by the Gauls was due not to the fact that these people were generally so far advanced beyond their neighbors, but rather to the fact that they had been instructed by the Druid priests among them. Tradition has it that the original Druidic priests came to Gaul and other countries from some far-off land, probably from Egypt or Greece. We have spoken of the connection between their teachings and that of the Pythagoreans, and there was undoubtedly a strong bond of relationship between these priests and the occultists of other lands. The Druidic priests were well versed in astronomy and astrology, and the planets had an important part in the teachings. A portion of their ritual is said to have correspondences with the early Jewish rites and worship. Their favorite symbol, the mistletoe, was used as indicating rebirth, the mistletoe being the new life springing forth from the old one, typified by the oak. The Druids traveled into ancient Britain and Ireland, and many traces of their religious rites may still be found there, not only in the shape of the stone places of worship, but also in many curious local customs among the peasantry. Many a bit of English folklore, many an odd Irish fancy concerning fairies and the like, symbols of good luck, banshees, and the little folk, came honestly to these people from the days of the Druids. And from the same source came the many whispered tales among both races regarding the birth of children who seemed to have remembrances of former lives on earth, which memory faded away as they grew older. Among these people, there is always an undercurrent of mystic ideas about souls coming back in some mysterious way not fully understood. It is the inheritance from the Druids. Chapter 3. The Romans and Greeks. One unfamiliar with the subject would naturally expect to find the ancient Romans well advanced along the lines of philosophy, religion, and spiritual speculation, judging from the all-powerful influence exerted by them over the affairs of the whole known world. Particularly when one considers the relationship with and connection of Rome with ancient Greece, it would seem that the two peoples must have had much in common in the world of thought. But such is not the case. Although the exoteric religions of the Romans resembled that of the Greeks, from whom it was borrowed or inherited, there was little or no original thought along metaphysics, religion, or philosophy among the Romans. This was probably due to the fact that the whole tendency of Rome was toward material advancement and attainment, little or no attention being given to matters concerning the soul, future life, etc. Some few of the philosophers of Rome advanced theories regarding the future state, but beyond a vague sort of ancestor worship, the masses of the people took but little interest in the subject. Cicero, it is true, uttered words which indicate a belief in immortality, when he said in Scipio's dream, "Know that it is not thou, but thy body alone, which is mortal. The individual in his entirety resides in the soul, and not in the outward form. Learn, then, that thou art a god, thou the immortal intelligence which gives movements to a perishable body, just as the eternal God animates an incorruptible body." Pliny the Younger left writings which seem to indicate his belief in the reality of phantoms, and Ovid has written verses which would indicate his recognition of a part of man which survived the death of the body. But, on the whole, Roman philosophy treated immortality as a thing perchance existing, but not proven, and to be viewed rather as a poetical expression of a longing, rather than as an established or at least a well-grounded principle of philosophical thought. But Lucretius and others of his time and country protested against the folly of belief in the survival of the soul held by the other nations. He said that the fear of eternal life should be banished from the universe. It disturbs the peace of mankind, for it prevents the enjoyment of any security or pleasure. And Virgil praised and commended the philosophical attitude which was able to see the real cause of things, and was therefore able to reject the unworthy fear of a world beyond and all fears arising from such belief. But even many of the Roman philosophers, while denying immortality, believed in supernatural powers and beings, and were very superstitious and childlike in many respects, so that their philosophy of non-survival was evidently rather the result of temperament and pursuit of material things than a height of philosophical reasoning or metaphysical thought. And so, the Romans stand apart from the majority of the ancient peoples, insofar as the belief in reincarnation is concerned. While there were individual mystics and occultists among them, it still remains a fact that the majority of the people held no such belief. And in fact, the masses had no clearly defined ideas regarding the survival of the soul. It is a strange exception to the general rule, and one that has occasioned much comment and attention among thinkers along these lines. There was a vague form of ancestor worship among the Romans, but even this was along the lines of collective survival of the ancestors, and was free from the ordinary metaphysical speculations and religious dogmas. Roughly stated, the Roman belief may be expressed by an idea of a less material, or more subtle, part of man which escaped disintegration after death, and which in some mysterious way passed on to combine with the ancestral soul which composed the collective ancestral deity of the family, the peace and pleasure of which were held as sacred duties on the part of the descendants, sacrifices and offerings being made toward this end. Nevertheless, here and there, among the Romans, were eminent thinkers who seemingly held a vague, tentative belief in some form of reincarnation, as, for instance, Ovid, who says, "Nothing perishes, although everything changes here on earth. The souls come and go unendingly in visible forms. The animals which have acquired goodness will take upon them human form." And Virgil says, "After death, the souls come to the Elysian fields or to Tartarus, and there meet with the reward or punishment of their deeds during life. Later, on drinking of the waters of Lethe, which takes away all memory of the past, they return to earth." But it must be admitted that Rome was deficient in spiritual insight and beliefs. On the whole, her material successes having diverted her attention from the problems which had so engrossed the mind of her neighbor Greece and her older sisters Persia, Chaldea, and Egypt. Among the Greeks, on the contrary, we find a marked degree of interest and speculation regarding the immortality of the soul, and much interest in the doctrines of metempsychosis or reincarnation. Although the great masses of the Grecian people were satisfied with their popular mythology and not disposed to question further or to indulge in keen speculation on metaphysical subjects, still the intellectual portion of the race were most active in their search after truth, and their schools of philosophy, with their many followers and adherents, have left an indelible mark upon the thought of man unto this day. Next to the Hindus, the Greeks were the great philosophers of the human race, and the occultists and mystics among them were equal to those of Persia, India, Chaldea, or Egypt. While the various theories regarding the soul were as the sands of the sea, so many were the teachers, schools, and divisions of thought among these people. Still, the doctrine of reincarnation played a very important part in their philosophy. The prevailing idea was that the worthy souls pass on to a state of bliss without rebirth, while the less worthy pass the waters of the river of Lethe, quaffing of its waters of forgetfulness, and thus having the recollection of their earth life and of the period of punishment that they had undergone by reason of the same, obliterated and cleansed from their memories when they pass on to rebirth. One of the old Orphic hymns reads as follows: "The wise love light and not darkness. When you travel the journey of life, remember, always, the end of the journey. When souls return to the light after their sojourn on earth, they wear upon their more subtle bodies, like searing, hideous scars, the marks of their earthly sins. These must be obliterated, and they go back to earth to be cleansed. But the pure, virtuous, and strong proceed direct to the son of Dionysus." The teachings of the Egyptians left a deep impression upon the Grecian mind, and not only the common form of belief, but also the esoteric doctrines were passed along to the newer people by the elder. Pythagoras was the great occult teacher of Greece, and his school and that of his followers accepted and taught the great doctrine of reincarnation. Much of his teaching was reserved for the initiates of the mystic orders founded by himself and his followers, but still much of the doctrine was made public. Both Orpheus and Pythagoras, although several centuries separated them, were students at the fount of knowledge in Egypt, having traveled to that country in order to be initiated in the mystic orders of the ancient land, and returning, they taught anew the old doctrine of rebirth. The Pythagorean teaching resembles that of the Hindus and Egyptians, insofar as is concerned the nature of man, his several bodies or sheaths, and the survival of the higher part of his nature while the lower part perishes. It was taught that after death, This higher part of the soul passed on to a region of bliss, where it received knowledge and felt the beneficent influence of developed and advanced souls, thus becoming equipped for a new life with incentives toward higher things. But, not having as yet reached the stage of development which will entitle it to dwell in the blissful regions for all eternity, it sooner or later reaches the limit of its term of probation, and then passes down toward another incarnation on earth, another step on the path of attainment. The teaching was, further, that the conditions, circumstances, and environments of the new earth life were determined by the actions, thoughts, and mental tendencies of the former life, and by the degree of development which the several previous earth lives had manifested. In this respect, the teaching agrees materially with the universal doctrine regarding reincarnation and karma. Pythagoras taught that the doctrine of reincarnation accounted for the inequality observable in the lives of men on earth, giving a logical reason for the same, and establishing the fact of universal and ultimate justice, accountable for on no other grounds. He taught that although the material world was subject to the laws of destiny and fatality, yet there was another and higher state of being in which the soul would rise above the laws of the lower world. This higher state, he taught, had laws of its own, as yet unknown to man, which tended to work out the imperfect laws of the material world, establishing harmony, justice, and equality to supply the apparent deficiencies manifested in the earth life. Following Pythagoras, Plato, the great Grecian philosopher, taught the old-new doctrine of rebirth. He taught that the souls of the dead must return to earth, where in new lives they must wear out the old earth deeds, receiving benefits for the worthy ones and penalties for the unworthy ones, the soul profiting by these repeated experiences, and rising step by step toward the divine. Plato taught that the reincarnated soul has flashes of remembrance of its former lives, and also instincts and intuitions gained by former experiences. He classed innate ideas among these inherited experiences of former lives. It has been well said that everything can be found in Plato, and therefore one who seeks for the ancient Grecian ideas concerning reincarnation and the problems of the soul may find that which he seeks in the writings of the old sage and philosopher. Plato was the past master of the inner teachings concerning the soul, and all who have followed him have drawn freely from his great store of wisdom. His influence on the early Christian church was enormous, and in many forms it continues even unto this day. Many of the early Christian fathers taught that Plato was really one of the many forerunners of Christ, who had prepared the pagan world for the coming of the Master. In Phaedo, Plato describes the soul and explains its immortality. He teaches that man has a material body which is subject to constant change and subject to death and disintegration, and also an immaterial soul, unchangeable and indestructible and akin to the divine. At death, this soul was severed from its physical companion and rose, purified, to the higher regions, where it rendered an account of itself and had its future allotted to it. If it was found sufficiently untainted and unsullied by the mire of material life, it was considered fit to be admitted to the state of bliss, which was described as union with the Supreme Being, which latter is described as spirit, eternal, and omniscient. The base and very guilty souls undergo a period of punishment, or purgation, to the end that they may be purged and purified of the guilt before being allowed to make another trial for perfection. The souls which were not sufficiently pure for the state of bliss, nor yet so impure that they need the purging process, were returned to earth life, there to take up new bodies and endeavor to work out their salvation anew, to the end that they might in the future attain the blissful state. Plato taught that in the rebirth, the soul was generally unconscious of its previous lives, although it may have flashes of recollection. Besides this, it has a form of intuition and innate ideas, which was believed to be the result of the experiences gained in the past lives, and which knowledge had been stored up so as to benefit the soul in its reincarnated existence. Plato taught that the immaterial part of man, the soul, was a complex thing, being composed of a number of differing, though related, elements. Highest in the hierarchy of the soul elements, he placed the spirit, which, he taught, comprised consciousness, intelligence, will, choice between good and evil, etc. and which was absolutely indestructible and immortal, and which had its seat in the head. Then came two other parts of the soul, which survived the dissolution of the body, but which were only comparatively immortal, that is, they were subject to later dissolution and disintegration. Of these semi-material elements, one was the seat of the affections, passions, etc., and was located in the heart, while the other, which was the seat of the sensual and lower desires, passions, etc., was located in the liver. These two mentioned lower elements were regarded as not possessed of reason, but still having certain powers of sensation, perception, and will. The Neoplatonists, who followed Plato, and who adapted his teachings to their many conflicting ideas, held firmly to the doctrine of reincarnation. The writings of Plotinus, Porphyry, and the other mystics had much to say on this subject, and the teaching was much refined under their influence. The Jewish philosophers were affected by the influence of the Platonic thought